Good morning. USA Boxing is absolutely incorrect. Trans females should absolutely not be allowed to engage in combat sport versus females. Now, as a school teacher, I don't usually like to make such extreme or 100% statements like something's absolutely wrong or something's absolutely right, because when I discuss things with students, I like to say, well, there's always possibilities of this, and we need to be open to other people's opinions and such. But in this particular case, no trans female should be allowed to compete in any combat sport, whether it's boxing, wrestling, judo, sambo, jiu-jitsu, fencing. No trans female should be allowed to compete against a female in combat sport. Number one, because of pure and simple just safety. Combat athletes, literally, we put our lives at risk, particularly in any sport where you're taking strikes to the head, whether that's boxing, kickboxing, MMA, Thai boxing, etc. Okay, so we're putting our heads at risk. Number two, any other combat sport that doesn't involve striking, we are putting our physical bodies at risk. So for wrestling, judo, and all the other combat sports, we're risking getting our joints ripped, and those are life-changing injuries. Head injury could, of course, be fatal. So what is USA Boxing thinking? They want to put female athletes at greater risk for subdural hematoma or long-term effect, CTE. I'm going to say that because over the course of time, if women sustain more impact to the head, I would imagine that there's chance of getting CTE is greater. But certainly in the moment of the fight, having a female subjected to much greater power and force behind the punches to the head and to the body, first of all, there's no way that's fair, and second of all, that's just asking for an injury and a fatality to happen. So at risk of having my channel or myself get canceled, USA Boxing just gone too far, and society has gone too far, because they've actually opened the door for USA Boxing to even consider allowing trans females to compete against females. What are we thinking? This just makes no sense. But I need to back up what I'm saying. So let's look at this a little more scientifically. Okay, so a trans female at some point or has male physiology, because that's how they were born. So their shoulders are wider, shoulders are wider, hips are narrower, and then the knees and legs go more or less straight down. So purely from a boxing standpoint, typically a male will have more upper body mass and a female will have more lower body mass. So because the male has more upper body mass, their center of gravity is a little bit higher. Because their shoulders are wider, they can generate more torque when they rotate their torso, regardless of arm length. If all things are equal, somebody with wider shoulders and a higher center of mass will generate more torque at the end of their punch, because their arm is the lever. You can look at the formula. Force equals the length of the lever times the torque equals the length of the lever times the force, right? So they're generating more torque behind their punches simply based on physics. This has nothing to do with technique. This has nothing to do with speed. Okay, so there's just the mere mechanics of a punch being thrown by somebody with much wider shoulders. Now let's add to that the muscularity that's already developed, and that breaks down into typically males have more fast twitch than females. So the force behind that punch, the force of impact, is also going to be greater if it's delivered at a faster rate. I mean, I don't think there's much to argue about that a male's punch is going to generate much more force, and it's going to be delivered with more power than a female's punch. Now we can search for outliers, like we could find a weak male and compare him to the strongest female, but that's not really a fair comparison. If trans females want to compete in sport, in my opinion, they should just create a separate category. I would tend to agree with what Christy Martin said, that when you choose to transition from male to female, you kind of cede your right to compete in any athletic competition, because the starting line is not equal. We're not competing as equals anymore. If somebody was born into a male body and developed, and certainly if they went through puberty as a male, then the mechanics are completely different. Their identity and their cosmetic appearance might be female, but it's just their physicality, there's still male attributes underneath that. So it's firstly unfair, and then secondly, in combat sport, completely dangerous. So in amateur sport, people have rights, and so I'm not sure what drove USA Boxing's decision. If they're just fearful that they will encounter a lawsuit, so they sort of just said, okay, we'll allow this to happen in anticipation of avoiding a lawsuit. Let's look at the professional ranks. In pro boxing, everything's basically a business transaction, effectively. So if a female said, okay, sure, I'll sign on the dotted line to fight a trans female, I'm not sure if it would go, I assume, state by state, if the state commission would allow that to happen, and if of course, if the promoter is willing to put that on their card, and if a belt is involved, then if the sanctioning body is also willing to allow a trans female to compete for a female belt, then I mean it's all business, right? So if everybody signs on the dotted line, then it's allowable. But I think we've lost our minds if we think this is a good idea. I don't know where it stops. Does a female boxer have to get a life-changing injury, or does she have to die, or be put into a coma, suffer of subdural hematoma? Does a female fighter have to suffer in order for us to correct this? I certainly hope not. So I personally don't technically have any dogs in the fight, so to speak, because I'm not competing at the amateur level. I will not be competing at the amateur level, because once you turn pro, you can't go back and compete as an amateur. But I just think it's also incredibly discouraging, because let's say there's a young female amateur fighter who is, say, in high school, and they want to compete in boxing. Well, does that mean they have to compete against a trans female who, a biological male who identifies as female and then decides to enter this boxing tournament as a, in the junior ranks? Okay, I think that's really unfair and really not safe. So looking out for the younger generation, I just think that's a real shame, because let's face it, the trans female has all the physical advantages, and if they are halfway diligent about training, they will likely prevail. But then it's not even just a matter of like who's collecting the medals and who's collecting the trophies and who gets ranked and publicized as being the champion or winning. I can't imagine what it would feel like to compete against a trans female and just feel completely dominated and know that there's nothing you can do about it. Because at a certain point, no matter how good you are technically, if you're overpowered and outgunned, you're gonna take a beating, and that's gonna be way more traumatic for that young female fighter. So yes, my request is that USA Boxing reconsider. And I appreciate the fact that leaders in the sport, such as Christy Martin, have already spoken out about this. I hope that other leaders in sport speak out about this, because I don't see a happy ending, so to speak. I don't see this turning out well. I only see injury, unnecessarily so, injuries, and hopefully not fatalities, but it's possible. So now let's just, for the sake of argument, flip this the other way. Is it fair for trans males to compete in sport versus males? Now, some would argue that, well, a trans male is working at a deficit, right? Because they were born into a female body. So, by the same reverse argument, the shoulders are narrower, hips a little bit wider, and females tend to be more sort of knock-kneed, so to speak. So, in terms of generating force and torque, females that are more disadvantaged. Also, in terms of musculature, females are more at a disadvantage than a male. So we could say, well, hey, they're choosing to compete against other biological males. That's fair, because they're opting in and perhaps giving away a physical advantage. But here's my counter argument question, really, because I don't know the answer to this. But what's the ceiling on how much testosterone a trans male can have in their system? Because I'm assuming that they're continually taking testosterone in order to maintain their male characteristics. I don't know. I'm ignorant on this topic, and I don't know what the upper limit is. But is it different because you're a trans male and you must take testosterone? You know, is the limit different for you for a trans male than it would be for a male? These are just questions that someone or we can look into, right? Like, is it possible for a trans male to have so much testosterone in their system that it would be akin to a male being on PEDs? And is that fair? I mean, I don't know. Really, I think men should chime in on that if it is a concern for them, or if it's not a concern for them, they can voice that. But certainly for me, there's just no way trans females should be allowed to compete in any combat sport at the amateur level, at the pro level, versus females, because it's just too much of a physical risk. And it's just, even if a fatality doesn't happen in that particular one particular fight, it's just, what's the point? I don't understand how that's even quote unquote entertaining, or I just don't get the point. I think if we're at the level where there's enough trans athletes, then let's make a division for them separate, because it's not fair to put them in the same division. What are your thoughts on that? Please comment down below. I'm very interested in hearing what we have to say about this. Thank you.